To recap what we talked about inside here, to me, the most valuable part of a senior DBA is processes. Being able to do things repeatedly again and again in writing, to have down, here's exactly how I approach that problem and not wing it every time. Winging it is what I expect a junior DBA to do, or a sysadmin who's constantly facing different technologies. But once you've committed to being a senior DBA, that this is the technology you're going to work with for the rest of your life or the rest of your career, then I expect to see people have things in writing and make them repeatable processes, just like an engineer or a doctor would, thought trees, decision matrices. A great example of that, and where so much of my answers start, is here. Backups are driven by this architecture, when you run CheckDB, how much backup space you need, how you do patching. All of it comes down to how much data we're willing to lose and how long we're allowed to be down for. The DBA doesn't come up with the goals, but the DBA does come up with current state. It's the DBA's job to fill in the current state column and then hand it to management and say, here's where we are today. Management, regardless of what boxes you check, management will say, what would it take to do better? And now you can start looking over at what technologies you'd use in order to get better and give them budgets and designs to, here's how it would look in order to get better. Knowing exactly how much data you're willing to lose and how long you're allowed to be down for, this starts to change the whole Zen systems administration thing, where I know if I only have enough tooling so that I'm going to lose a day's worth of data, or I'm going to be down for 2 days to rebuild the data warehouse, then I'm much more at peace with that. As I lay out in writing, here's what our environment looks like, then I can say, this is just what it is. This is the hardware that we have. And I don't freak out about trying to lose less data because it's just a business decision. If they want to lose less data, they can authorize the money for it. And if they don't want to authorize the money for it, that's cool. That's okay. But it's not on my back. I don't feel guilty about it anymore. This is just what they've decided to build in terms of an infrastructure. When someone comes running in for me, the triage form is one of my favorite resources. What are the symptoms looking like? What do I believe the root cause is? If I don't take action now, what are going to be the effects? This helps you start to build run books. When these symptoms happen, this is what the root cause looks like. And you can even get to the point where you're building scripting tools to automatically solve common problems. Tara Kaiser, for example, a coworker here at the company, is a senior DBA, built this decision tree to the point where if they were running into parameter sniffing problems due to one query getting a bad plan, she would just simply nuke the plan out of cache whenever it showed up. When you script this kind of thing, it just helps you have more free time available and focus on the harder problems to solve. When someone comes running in, these are the tools that you work through in order. Your monitoring software is there just to email you when the whole thing's on fire. SP Who is Active helps you determine if there's a big, long blocking chain and whether or not it's safe to kill that stored procedure or query. And then you work down through SP Blitz first, Blitz Cache, Blitz Index, and then finally Blitz. There's a ton of videos online with everything that we've talked about here. It's actually, the videos are like half a day behind. This morning's videos are already up and running online. So go to BrentOzar.com, click training at the top of the page, and then scroll down to the senior DBA area where it says to watch recordings for the senior DBA class. If you can't see that, email help@BrentOzar.com with your receipt so that we can match up the right email address to the right person who's supposed to get the training. Now, going forward, for the rest of your life, when you run into SQL Server problems, feel free to email us. Email help@BrentOzar.com. Mention that you were in this class because we literally get homework questions all day, every day, easily 50 emails a week, a minimum just saying, can you do this homework for me? When you do include it, though, I want this. I want to know what your server's RPO and RTO are, even if it's just the current state. Fill in the current state at least, because so often people will say, which solution should I choose? And it's so heavily dependent on this. If it's questions about health or performance, also include SP Blitz with the check server info equals 1 and SP Blitz first since startup equals 1. You can copy paste those directly into a spreadsheet and then email those in. I will ask for those. I will be a stickler about those because it really does impact so many of the answers that we give. The entire team watches that email inbox too, so any of us will jump in and answer questions whenever it says, I'm a student, here's the class I was in, and here's my supporting info. Now here's what my question is. Now is your chance for open questions. We will go as long as you guys have questions. Feel free to type your questions in now. Let's see here. Justin says, is there a system table that keeps track of whether an index was rebuilt or reorged? Not exactly. There are system tables, and I want to say it's sys indexes. If you go view the source code on SP Blitz Index, we'll show you a warning when the index was recently modified. SQL Server doesn't tell us whether it was rebuilt or created or like somebody did a drop existing. It just says that there was a big, huge change to that index. Fred says, related to patching, if you have not had any sort of patching within your infrastructure, how do you recommend introducing this need? It just comes down to RPO and RTO. And also incorrect query results. If I really wanted to tackle that, what I would do is I would go pull the last couple of cumulative updates for the version that I'm on, make a list of the incorrect results bugs, because those are the ones that usually freak out end users. And just say, all right, just so everybody knows, the version of SQL Server that we're on is vulnerable to these 5 incorrect results bugs. And just include a link to the knowledge base article and say, if we want to start doing patching, here's what it would look like, and give them a rough idea of what your project plan would look like. Then go from there. Susie says, does AWS have any SQL Server monitoring tools? I know it can monitor the environment in general. Yeah, AWS has CloudWatch, and so CloudWatch just says things like perfmon counters, uptime, downtime, all that. But they have a brand new thing coming out that will monitor wait stats inside SQL Server. They're doing it for AWS RDS, Relational Database Services. It's working for RDS first, and it's, if I remember right, it's free. They only have it for MySQL and Postgres publicly today, but they're building it for SQL Server by the end of the year. So it's going to include line graphs or bar graphs for your wait stats to show you what your wait stats look like over time, plus information out of the plan cache to show you which queries are most likely causing those waits. If I remember right, it's totally free. Let me go pull the web or the blog post I did. So, So AWS RDS monitoring site, BrentOzar.com. They announced it at reInvent last year. There it is. So if you search for Brent Ozar, 7 things I learned about Aurora. Aurora is Amazon's hosted RDS or hosted MySQL and Postgres. That's actually their own query engine, their own storage engine under the covers. But in here I have, there you go. Amazon's throwing in performance monitoring tools, and it'll be out with RDS SQL Server in 2017. I follow the guys on Twitter who are doing it, who are coding it, and I can't remember what they are. If you look at that screenshot, so I've got a camera picture there, it gives you a rough idea of what the user interface looks like. They also have Performance Insights. That's what it's called. Yeah, Performance Insights. You can see examples of what the MySQL and Postgres user interface looks like, and then you can see what it'll look like for SQL Server. Go ahead and type your questions in, folks. And if you're not sure, you really should type them in, because when we go like 3 minutes without a question, I bail. And the end. Fred says, I've recently been told we should do lock pages in memory. I've seen that there's been a bunch of conversations both for and against. Yeah, Cahias's post is lock pages in memory. Jonathan Cahias's post sums it up really well. So Jonathan Cahias did this post on great SQL Server debates, lock pages in memory. And he says my side of it too, as well as his side. I am against lock pages in memory. Cahias is for lock pages in memory. I don't really mind which one people do, but the best way to explain it is if you go down into the comments, and I'm going to go way past other, because the article's great and it's really true, but you go down into the comments and they might have out of memory. Yeah. So read Jonathan Cahias' comment to Yagnesh. SQL Server, he says, with lock pages in memory, SQL Server will back down its usage to your min server memory value. At that point, Windows can either try and hard trim the other processes and potentially page them out, or if it can't respond efficiently, you may face a crash due to out of memory for the OS. I don't really like turning things on that cause crashes. So that's why I'm against lock pages in memory. Susie says, I have an availability group with 2 nodes in sync with a file share witness on SQL 2014. A few days ago, I manually failed over and everything looked good in Management Studio and Failover Cluster Manager after 30 seconds. However, the GIS application couldn't connect back up for about an hour. How do I go about troubleshooting this? Typically, it has to do with them connecting to the listener, and there are known problems in AWS, depending on how you have your subnet set up, where the listener comes online on one server, but AWS doesn't route any traffic to it. What I would have the developers do is connect to the SQL Server by name by the server name, not the listener name. Try connecting by name from their applications. And if that works, it does narrow it down to a listener problem. The simple workaround for this is that you put your replicas in different subnets. So they can be in the same data center, but you just have to put them in. You don't have to. This just makes troubleshooting easier. Put them in different subnets so they have different listener IPs. Both of the listener IPs will be in DNS at all times. So you have to use this parameter in your connection string called multi-subnet failover equals true. And I'm going to show you AWS always on SQL Server multi-subnet failover. Yeah, that's perfect. So if you search for that, Amazon has a document that explains how this works, how the connection parameter works. And so the application is going to try to connect to all of the listener IPs at any given time. This just bypasses the problem of failing the listener IP address around. Fred says, what are the pros and cons of priority boost on SQL Server? One of the best ways I can explain this is just run SP Blitz. When you run SP Blitz, for every warning that comes up, there's a URL for more details. And so the more details one for priority boost, and I want to say it's priority boost. Yep, perfect. So if you search for Blitz priority results or priority boost, we've got links to Microsoft's articles where they even tell you you shouldn't be turning that on anymore. Something that sounded good a long time ago, it doesn't work well today. Javier says, for a SQL Server only running SQL Server, do you have hyper-threading on or off? Let me pull up the virtualization deck because it has a diagram in it that'll make this easier to explain. There we go. All right, so this is a diagram of an Intel Xeon processor. And say that it's got 4 cores in it, just because it's nice little 4 lines here. And say that for L3 cache, because this is measured in megabytes, how little L3 cache I have. Just to keep the numbers simple, let's say we have 4 cores and 4 megabytes of L3 cache. When you turn on hyperthreading, you suddenly have what appear to be twice as many cores. You now have 8 cores, but you didn't magically double the amount of cache you have. And effectively, each thread has half as much cache now. So the idea is that if you have the kind of workload that would benefit from a larger L3 cache, then hyperthreading is bad. If you don't need L3 cache, then hyperthreading is fine. In the real world, what does that mean for SQL Server? It's different for every frickin' workload. So I just default hyperthreading to on. I'm completely fine with it. He says, continues on with, if it's on, how would it affect your max stop settings? Not at all. Makes no difference whatsoever. Susie says, what do you think of SQL Server's management data warehouse? When it came out, it was supposed to be a free monitoring tool. And ever since, when it came out, every time I looked at a SQL Server where it was turned on, its collection queries were the biggest performance problem on the server. They're just not written well. They don't give you a lot of the data that you want, and they take huge resources to get it. So the built-in collector queries suck really bad. But I heard back in the 2008 R2 days when it came out, I heard some really advanced users saying, if you write your own collection queries, but you use Management Data Warehouse's infrastructure to gather the data and then do reporting on top of it, that it wasn't so bad. At which point I'm like, why would you not just buy a monitoring tool? If the monitoring tool sucks and you have to rewrite it, don't rewrite it. It's garbage. Fred says, are Glenberry's diagnostic queries helpful with your list of triage scripts? I find that Glenberry's queries are useful to teach you things. They teach you how SQL Server works internally. They teach you how what DMV data is presented. But if you're in an emergency for performance, you probably don't have the time to step through each of those and interpret them unless you live with them every day, like people like Glenn or other high-end consultants, those of us who just live, eat, and breathe the EMVs. Then those kind of things can be helpful. I kind of prefer ours because it gives you, hey buddy, here's a prioritized list of what's broken so that you don't have to go query all kinds of other DMVs. So the kind of tricky answer here is, if you want to learn about SQL Server just for your own purposes, go run Glenn's queries. If you're trying to troubleshoot an emergency, you may want to try the approach I used here because it's so much faster. Martha says, where do you suggest putting the binaries in the system databases? Well, SQL Server's binaries are really only used when it starts up. And the same thing with the system databases, master, model, MSDB. The MSDB is a little different. It gets hit whenever there's things like backup jobs. I don't have that many occasions where performance tuning of master and model is important for me. It just hasn't been on my radar, so I don't really care where people put them. I would, if I'm dealing with a SQL Server with, say, local space, I like putting TempDB on its own volume, and I like putting the system databases on something other than C. I don't care what it is, just not the C drive, because I've seen a lot of users accidentally create tables in master or in MSDB and then put a lot of data in them. And if there's databases on the C drive and they grow and fill up, starting Windows with a full C drive sucks. It's a giant pain in the rear. So as long as they're off the C drive, I don't even care if it's like a mirrored pair that's just split off space from the C drive. They can be on the same spindles. I just want them on a dedicated volume so that if some yo-yo fills it up, Windows still boots. There we go. We're caught up on questions. Feel free to type your questions in, folks. It's 1:44. Glenn's a fantastic guy. Glenn and I are friends. He's really smart and drives a Tesla. Woo! Fred says, are there any good resources related to SQL on Linux that you can recommend? The problem is that the product isn't out yet, so it's not finalized. So it doesn't really make sense to build good training material on it when the product could change dramatically before launch. For example, SQL Agent was only supported like a month and a half ago. So I haven't seen any good resources on it that I would recommend. Instead, I would say, if you're going to use SQL Server on Linux, forget learning SQL Server on Linux, just learn Linux. That's going to be the biggest barrier between you and a successful SQL on Linux deployments. You need to get good at process tuning, memory handling, it's storage allocation, performance tuning over on just Linux in general. Fred says, do you have any predictions about how much SQL on Linux might bring to the market? Zero. Absolutely nothing. It's going to be a drop in the bucket compared to conventional Windows deployments. Microsoft's doing it because they have customers who refuse to run Windows in their data center, and they have third-party apps that require SQL Server. So it's relatively small in terms of the marketplace. Susie says, any good resources to improve our skills after this course? Tell me more specifically about what you want to learn, because, of course, the database market is so huge and it's all over the place. Fred says, I'm curious about SQL on Linux as a replacement of MySQL. Well, MySQL is free. SQL Server on Linux is $2,000 a core for standard edition. Don't think it's going to really make a dent in that marketplace there. Susie says always on availability groups and clustering. Man, what sucks about this here is this is a topic that's got a big gaping hole in the market. It's really popular in terms of a topic, but there's not a lot of trainers doing work on it. There's really only 2 people doing training on clustering and always on availability groups. Those 2 people are SQLHA.com. SQLHA is Alan Hurt. He's a clustering MVP. He has a set of always-on and failover clustering classes that are like 3 days long. He brings them around to different places in the U.S. He's in the midst of writing an updated book on clustering in SQL Server, but he's been writing it for like 3 or 4 years now. It's a kind of a running joke in the SQL Server community. At someday he'll finish it, but it just hasn't come out anytime soon. So that's one. The other one is, to pop open in another window there, Edwin Sarmiento. So Edwin Sarmiento has a lot of resources on SQL Server or always on and failover clustering, including online training courses that you can go through and walk through, online video-based stuff. So if you look at failover clustering for the Smart SQL Server DBA, this is not an intro course. It assumes that you already know good foundational stuff about SQL Server. So I think it's good for this audience. I want to say it's like $500 for that course, and he only does lets people into it like once a quarter. So then at a certain time, everybody gets into it and they all progress through the class together. Good, it's reopening again on April 17th. I want to say it's about $500 ballpark. Let's see, next one. Let me pull the questions thing back over onto this side. Martha says, does anyone actually use DQS, data quality services? It seems like it's not so good, but my developers keep wanting to try it. Yeah, that's the same thing I hear from MVPs who've used data quality services and master data services, that it just isn't baked to the point where it's really a workable solution yet. Microsoft does seem to still be investing in it, but I would just make sure it actually works and does what you want it to before I would go and implement it. Make sure to have them do it on a separate server somewhere, because I've heard a lot of horror stories about that. Let's see. Martha says, is there a third-party tool that would work? I actually don't do anything with BI. The person that I would ask is, let me go pop up EntDNA. Let's say it's EntDNA. Andy Leonard. I always get the DNA, the EntDNA. Yeah, that was right. Enterprise Data and Analytics. If you go to entdna.com, this is Andy Leonard, does business intelligence consulting. Nicest guy in the world, would give you the shirt off his back. So you can go hit the contact us today thing and he'll email you with any kind of answers about that kind of thing. He doesn't do DQS as far as I know, but he'll know the right people who do. Fred says, in relation to Susie's question, advanced skills in performance monitoring more at the server level than the database level? Yeah, that's a big chunk of our performance tuning class. So we offer this 4-day performance tuning class, and I'm just going to go over to brentozar.com/training. The performance tuning class happens to start next week. I run it like 4 times a year. If you go to our site and hit training, then scroll all the way down to the bottom, there's a performance tuning class. I run it both online and in person. It's exactly the same type of setup that we have here. It's actually, I would say, longer in that we sometimes run till 5 or 6 at night. It's kind of challenging. And then I'm going to go hit watch the recording only so that, and you can click this too. When you click watch the recording, you see the whole list of modules going down the right-hand side. So then you can see we start with the first 2 days are how do the internals of SQL Server work for page handling, query building, index tuning. Then starting on day 3, we talk about how do you measure a SQL Server, what do common weight types mean, and so forth. Let's see. Helen says, can we have test instance and production instance on the same server? Absolutely, but there's a huge problem with that. Licensing costs. So production licensing is really expensive. Test or like development licensing, maybe not so much. And since they're stepping on each other in terms of CPU and memory, that's really the most expensive CPU power that you have in the house. So I wouldn't run development type stuff on a production instance. Plus, my developers just always tend to run really big monster queries, like they'll change a table schema and absolutely hammer storage. And if it's on the same server, they're sharing the same pipe over to storage. Fred says, do you give discounts to those who've attended the senior DBA class? It's something that we've talked about. Right now, we just run public sales from time to time. So in May, we'll be running I want to say it's 50% off the online classes for August. So we don't run them for the in-person classes, just only for the online classes. May will be our 6th anniversary, so we'll probably run a 50% off sale for the next round of classes in August then. All right, other questions? Going. It was fun having you guys in here this week. You asked a lot of good questions. It's always interesting to see. There's so many more questions I always see in an in-person class where people are just always raising their hands. Hey, one more thing. Susie says, thank you so much. You guys are absolutely welcome. Don't forget about your online equivalent. You can go through and rewatch these. And especially when you first go in there, the first couple of modules that you'll watch from day one are kind of crappy AV quality. I didn't get the recording the way I wanted this week. Don't get discouraged by the first couple of recordings. Jump around to different modules and you'll see that the quality of the remaining ones. Well, thanks everybody for hanging out with me this week, and I will see you guys around on the internet. Fred says you're one of the best explaining clearly on so many things. I appreciate the training. You're welcome. Javier and Justin say thank you. You guys are welcome. Adios. See you next time.